When a 20-year-old gets involved with his best friend's 61-year-old grandmother, it's a secret no one was ever meant to know. She was wealthy, glamorous, and willing to give him anything he wanted. But obsession has a price. What started as late-night hotel meetings and whispered promises ended in a bloody confrontation that shocked the entire neighborhood. And when the truth came out, two lives were gone, and one young man's future was over before it began. Subscribe to True Crimes Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Like, comment, because these are the stories the guilty prayed would stay buried. It was hard to believe that what began as an ordinary friendship between two boys would unravel into one of the most shocking tragedies Willow Heights had ever witnessed. A 20-year-old college student named Elliot Warren had been best friends with Jamal Rivers since middle school, the kind of bond that looked unbreakable from the outside. They spent years side by side, through basketball games at the community center, late-night video games in Jamal's basement, and the everyday grind of school and neighborhood life. Their families were close, too. Elliot practically grew up in Jamal's house, where Jamal's grandmother, Loretta Rivers, always kept the fridge full and the atmosphere warm. Loretta, at 61, was a woman who defied her age. She carried herself with elegance, her salt and pepper curls styled in ways that highlighted her smooth skin and sharp cheekbones. She was known around Willow Heights as classy and refined, someone who had built herself up after her husband's death and maintained her home with pride. People often whispered that she didn't look anywhere near her age, and they were right. She had a certain glow, a youthful energy, and a figure that her tailored dresses and silk blouses only enhanced. Elliot always respected her as Jamal's grandmother, but there were moments, especially as he got older, when her presence stirred something he couldn't explain. Elliot was ambitious but struggling. College expenses weighed heavy, and his part-time job barely kept the lights on in his small apartment. He often found himself envying Jamal, who didn't have to worry as much, since Loretta had money to fall back on. Elliot never said it aloud, but he noticed how easily Jamal leaned on his grandmother's financial support. Loretta herself noticed Elliot's struggles. She was attentive, always asking him how classes were going, whether he was eating enough, whether his rent was up to date. At first, it felt like the kind of concern any grandmother might have, but her eyes lingered a little too long sometimes, and her compliments carried a warmth that made Elliot uncomfortable and flattered at the same time. Things began to shift one evening when Elliot dropped by to study with Jamal. Loretta came into the living room wearing a fitted emerald green dress, the kind that clung to her curves and looked more suited to a cocktail party than an evening at home. Jamal barely looked up from the game controller in his hand, but Elliot found himself stealing glances. Loretta noticed. She smiled at him, that slow, knowing kind of smile that made his chest tighten. From then on, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that Loretta was paying him special attention. She would compliment his shirt, touch his arm lightly when speaking, or offer him glasses of wine while Jamal was busy in another room. Elliot tried to ignore it, convincing himself he was imagining things, but the signals became harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, Jamal remained oblivious. He saw Elliot as his brother, and he had no reason to suspect that the person he trusted most in the world was beginning to feel the pull of something dangerous with his own grandmother. Elliot's financial stress grew worse when his landlord warned him about late rent. That week, Loretta invited him to stay for dinner while Jamal went out with friends. The meal was lavish: steak, roasted vegetables, expensive wine, and when Elliot thanked her, she brushed it off with a wave of her manicured hand. "You deserve nice things," she told him, her eyes lingering on his face. Before he left, she slipped a folded bill into his hand, $100 crisp and clean. "Just to help with groceries," she said. Elliot protested, but she insisted, her hand closing over his. The contact sent a shiver down his spine. That small gesture opened a door he didn't know how to close. Soon, Loretta found reasons to invite him over when Jamal wasn't around. Sometimes it was to help carry groceries, sometimes to fix something around the house. Each time, she found a way to get closer, standing near him in the kitchen, praising his strength, brushing against him as if by accident. Elliot told himself he was just being polite, but he also couldn't deny how good it felt to be admired, to be wanted. Loretta was vibrant, elegant, and carried herself like a woman decades younger. She laughed easily. Her perfume lingered when she walked past, and her eyes sparkled when they locked onto his. Slowly, Elliot's defenses began to weaken. Jamal, for his part, noticed little changes. Elliot seemed distracted during their hangouts, sometimes checking his phone with a faint smile, sometimes canceling plans with vague excuses. Jamal figured it was school stress, or maybe a girl Elliot wasn't ready to talk about. He had no idea that the truth was brewing in his own home. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon when Elliot was supposed to meet Jamal at the park, but instead ended up in Loretta's living room. She poured him a glass of wine and sat close enough that their knees touched. She told him he had potential, that he was too bright to let life weigh him down. Then, in a pause that stretched too long, she leaned in and pressed her lips against his cheek. Elliot froze, his pulse racing. When he turned to look at her, she didn't pull back. She held his gaze, her smile soft and inviting. The air between them felt charged, dangerous, and yet irresistible. Elliot knew in that moment that a line had been crossed, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Elliot lay awake that night, replaying the moment in Loretta's living room, the soft pressure of her lips, the faint sweetness of her perfume. He told himself it was a mistake, that he should create some distance, but the thought of her lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't stop humming. The next time he saw her, it was as if nothing had happened, at least on the surface. Loretta moved through the kitchen with her usual grace, chatting about errands and the weather, but her eyes met his with a glimmer of something private, something they both understood. Days later, she texted him out of the blue, asking if he wanted to join her for lunch at a quiet restaurant on the edge of town. Jamal wasn't mentioned, and Elliot didn't ask. When he arrived, she was already seated at a corner table, wearing a sleek cream blouse and gold earrings that caught the light. The conversation flowed easily. She asked about his classes, his plans for the summer, and when he mentioned how expensive tuition was getting, she reached across the table, brushing her fingertips over his hand. "You work too hard for too little," she said softly. "Let me take care of you a little." Elliot felt a rush of conflicting emotions, gratitude, unease, and something dangerously close to desire. When the check came, she paid without hesitation, sliding her card to the waiter before Elliot could protest. That afternoon marked the start of a new rhythm between them. Loretta began sending him small gifts, a pair of sneakers he'd admired, envelopes with cash for gas, even a designer jacket. Elliot resisted at first, but each refusal melted under her persistence and her warmth. Jamal started noticing Elliot's upgraded wardrobe and teased him about having a secret admirer. Elliot laughed it off, never revealing the truth. Loretta, meanwhile, grew bolder. One evening she called and asked if he'd like to accompany her to a hotel downtown. "Just for dinner," she said, her voice calm but laced with something else. "I don't want to be interrupted tonight." Elliot hesitated. He knew what this could lead to, but curiosity and attraction outweighed caution. The hotel was an elegant boutique place with soft lighting in the lobby and polished floors that reflected the glow of chandeliers. Loretta met him at the entrance, her figure framed in a fitted black dress that hugged her curves, her hair in loose waves that softened her face. She looked nothing like anyone's grandmother, at least not in that moment. In the privacy of the suite, the air felt charged. She poured them both glasses of wine, invited him to sit on the couch, and asked about his dreams in a way that made him feel seen. The conversation drifted to more personal topics, and before long she was seated beside him, her thigh brushing his. When she laughed, her hand rested on his knee a second too long. Elliot's chest tightened. She leaned in to tuck a stray curl behind his ear, and that small gesture undid whatever restraint he'd been clinging to. They kissed, slow at first, then with the urgency of two people crossing a line they both knew they wanted to cross. Loretta pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "You're not a boy anymore, Elliot," she murmured, "and I'm not ready to feel old." Her words carried both vulnerability and challenge. They stayed in that room for hours, talking, touching, and savoring the privacy. By the time Elliot left, he knew their connection had shifted into something that couldn't be hidden forever. Back in Willow Heights, Jamal was beginning to sense that something wasn't right. Elliot's excuses for missing plans became more frequent, and he seemed distracted even when they hung out. Jamal didn't push, but a quiet suspicion was beginning to take root, one that would grow darker with every passing week. Elliot told himself he could keep the worlds separate, his friendship with Jamal and his romance with Loretta, but deep down, he knew that walls built on secrets never stood forever. Loretta's generosity didn't slow down after that night in the hotel. If anything, it increased. She began inviting Elliot to art galleries, jazz lounges, and upscale restaurants in nearby cities, places where no one from Willow Heights was likely to see them. She'd arrive dressed like she belonged in a magazine, her skin glowing, her heels clicking against polished floors. Elliot couldn't deny the pride he felt being seen with her, even if he had to pretend to be just a family friend when strangers asked. She seemed to thrive on the thrill, her hand brushing his under the table, her gaze holding his a second longer than necessary. But with every indulgence came a risk. One Saturday afternoon, Loretta invited Elliot to join her for a shopping trip at a luxury boutique downtown. He hesitated, but she promised it would be quick. Inside, she tried on a silk scarf, then draped it around his neck, laughing softly as she adjusted it. The moment was harmless to anyone watching, but if Jamal had seen it, there'd be no way to explain. Unbeknownst to them, Jamal had been growing uneasy for weeks. He'd noticed Elliot's phone lighting up with messages at odd hours, the way he sometimes smiled faintly before putting it away. He'd caught him once in the driveway, leaning against Loretta's car and talking on the phone in a low voice, the kind of conversation that ended abruptly when Jamal stepped outside. Jamal's unease hardened into suspicion when his cousin Malik mentioned seeing Elliot behind the wheel of Loretta's Lexus one night, alone. Elliot had brushed it off as running an errand for her, but Malik's words stayed with him. Meanwhile, Loretta and Elliot's relationship deepened. She began sharing stories from her past about feeling invisible after her husband's death, about how Elliot's presence made her feel alive again. Elliot admitted how much her support had changed his life, though guilt sometimes pricked at him when he thought about Jamal. The guilt faded fast during their second hotel meeting. Loretta had booked the same suite as before, this time with fresh flowers in a vase on the table and a playlist of soft R&B playing in the background. She greeted him in a deep red dress that flattered her figure, her hair pulled back to reveal the graceful lines of her neck. They sat close, knees touching, her perfume wrapping around him like a warm hand. The wine flowed, the conversation weaving between playful banter and quiet confessions. When she leaned in to kiss him, there was no hesitation from either of them. This time, their closeness was unbroken for hours, the boundaries between them dissolving completely. Outside that room, the rest of the world didn't exist. But back in Willow Heights, the tension was building. Rumors began to ripple through the neighborhood. Someone had seen Elliot and Loretta at a cafe 2 towns over. Another had noticed him carrying shopping bags from high-end stores she was known to frequent. Jamal's cousin Malik was the first to voice what others were starting to think. Something's going on there. Jamal didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit together in ways he couldn't ignore. He began watching Elliot more closely, his questions becoming sharper, his tone colder. Elliot noticed and tried to act normal, but the unease was there, sitting between them like a shadow. Loretta sensed it too. One evening, she warned Elliot, her voice low. "Jamal's not a fool. If he ever finds out, Elliot, there'll be no going back." Elliot nodded, but in his gut, he already knew the truth. Whatever they had, it was only a matter of time before it came to light. And when it did, the fallout would be brutal. It happened faster than Elliot could have imagined. On a warm Friday afternoon, Loretta had asked him to meet her at a boutique in the heart of the city. She said she needed a second opinion on a suit she was buying for a charity event. "You have a good eye for these things," she told him over the phone, her voice light, casual, like there was nothing unusual about a 61-year-old grandmother meeting her grandson's best friend for an afternoon of shopping. The plan was simple. She'd park a few blocks away from the boutique. He'd come in separately, and they'd shop quietly before heading to lunch at a quiet cafe across town. She wanted to avoid familiar faces, but Willow Heights was far enough that they didn't think twice about running into anyone they knew. What neither of them knew was that Jamal had driven into the city that same afternoon to meet an old high school friend. He was walking down the opposite side of the street when something caught his attention in the boutique window, 2 figures standing close together under soft golden light. His pace slowed. At first, his mind rejected what he was seeing, but as his eyes focused, there was no denying it. It was Elliot, leaning in slightly as Loretta laughed, her hand resting on his forearm. The sight hit Jamal like a fist to the gut. He stood on the sidewalk, frozen, watching them for several seconds that felt like hours. Loretta saw him first. Her smile faltered instantly, her hand slipping from Elliot's arm as her posture stiffened. Elliot noticed the change in her expression, followed her gaze, and felt the blood drain from his face. Jamal didn't move toward them. He simply stared, his jaw tight, his fists curling slowly at his sides before turning sharply and walking away. He didn't run, but his strides were long and deliberate, each step a barely contained explosion. The confrontation came that night. Jamal showed up at Loretta's house unannounced, his knock sharp and impatient. Elliot was there, sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine in his hand, trying to look relaxed but feeling anything but. Loretta opened the door, startled to see Jamal standing there with an expression like a storm cloud. "We need to talk," he said flatly, stepping past her before she could answer. The air in the living room turned thick. Jamal's voice started low, but the anger beneath it made every word feel like it could shatter glass. "What was that today? Don't lie to me. I saw you." Loretta tried to brush it off, saying Elliot was just helping her pick out an outfit, but Jamal's laugh was bitter. "Helping you shop? Is that what you call it now?" His eyes flicked to Elliot, who sat rigid, unable to meet his stare. The exchange escalated. Jamal's voice rose, the words turning into accusations, calling Elliot a user, saying he was taking advantage of an older woman for her money. Loretta's cheeks flushed with anger. She shot back that Elliot was more driven, more respectful, and more attentive than Jamal had been in years. Elliot kept his eyes down, wishing he could disappear, but every word felt like gasoline on a fire. Jamal's glare burned into him. "You really think this is okay? That you can smile in my face and do this behind my back?" Elliot opened his mouth, but no words came. The argument ended abruptly when Jamal shook his head in disgust and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Loretta exhaled sharply, muttering under her breath, but Elliot could feel the danger hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Over the next few days, Jamal's demeanor shifted completely. His texts to Elliot stopped. When they did see each other, his responses were short, his eyes cold. Elliot noticed the change and tried to act normal, but the weight of Jamal's silence pressed on him. Loretta told him to give it time, but her own tone was uneasy. Then came the moment that pushed Jamal past the point of return. He was in the kitchen one afternoon, flipping through the day's mail, when an envelope addressed to Loretta caught his eye. Inside was a folded hotel receipt. The name printed on it made his chest tighten: Elliot Warren. The date matched a night Elliot had told him he was working late. Jamal stared at the paper for a long moment before folding it carefully and sliding it into his pocket. That evening, Jamal didn't leave his room. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, the glow of a streetlight spilling through the blinds, the hotel receipt in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. His thoughts circled the same images over and over: Elliot behind the wheel of Loretta's Lexus, Elliot laughing with her in the boutique, Elliot walking into that hotel room. And underneath all of it was the sound of Loretta's voice defending Elliot, putting him above her own grandson. Elliot tried to call that night, but Jamal let the phone buzz until it stopped. Loretta sent Jamal a message too, but it went unanswered. In the days that followed, Jamal began drinking more heavily, his temper sharpening in every interaction. People noticed. His cousin Malik said he seemed different, like he was walking around with something heavy on his chest. The final crack came when Jamal overheard a conversation between Loretta and Elliot one evening. Loretta's voice was warm, affectionate, as she told Elliot she was thinking about rewriting her will to include him. Jamal stood in the hallway, every muscle in his body tightening with each word. He didn't hear Elliot's reply. He didn't need to. In his mind, the betrayal was complete. Whatever they had taken from him, trust, family, pride, was too big to give back. And somewhere deep in his chest, the decision was already forming. Loretta had spent the better part of the day preparing. She wanted the evening to feel special, the kind of night that reminded Elliot of how much he meant to her. The dining table in her softly lit kitchen was set with her best china, a bottle of wine breathing beside the crystal glasses. A roast chicken filled the air with rich, savory warmth, and faint jazz floated from the speaker in the corner. She wore a deep navy dress that fell just below her knees, a delicate necklace resting against her collarbone. Elliot arrived just after 8. He'd been feeling the tension in the air for days, but pushed it aside when he saw her smile at the door. They embraced, the familiarity of her perfume pulling him into the moment. He told her she looked stunning, and she blushed in that way that made her seem years younger. They sat down to eat, talking about classes, about a small trip they might take once the semester ended. The mood was easy, comfortable, at least until the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the air. Loretta's brow furrowed. "I'm not expecting anyone," she said quietly. Elliot's eyes flicked to the clock. The sound of a door slamming followed, then footsteps crunching on the path to the front door. Before either of them could move, Jamal's voice rang out through the hall. "I know you're in there." He appeared in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the table before locking on Elliot. There was no pretense this time, no attempt at civility. "You couldn't even wait until I was gone, huh?" His voice was sharp, almost trembling with rage. Elliot stood slowly. "Jamal, listen." But Jamal cut him off. "Shut up." His gaze darted to Loretta. "You two. I want to hear you say it. Tell me this is what it looks like." Loretta straightened her shoulders. "I don't owe you explanations about my life." Jamal's laugh was hollow, humorless. "Your life? You're my grandmother. And him," he jabbed a finger toward Elliot, "he's supposed to be my brother." Elliot took a step forward, hands raised in a calming gesture. "It's not like that. Don't lie to me." Jamal's voice cracked with anger, his eyes shining with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He moved closer, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. The air in the room thickened. Loretta stood between them, her tone firm but pleading. "This is not the way to handle this, Jamal. We can talk." Her words barely left her mouth before Jamal shoved Elliot hard in the chest. Elliot stumbled back, his chair toppling over behind him. Instinct took over, and he shoved back, the two of them grappling in the narrow space between the table and the wall. The wine bottle tipped, dark liquid spilling across the tablecloth and dripping to the floor. Loretta shouted for them to stop, trying to wedge herself between their bodies. In the chaos, Jamal's hand found the heavy crystal wine decanter sitting at the edge of the table. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles whitening. Elliot saw it too late. The decanter came down in a wild, arcing swing, connecting with the side of Elliot's head with a dull, sickening thud. Elliot's legs gave out instantly, his body collapsing to the hardwood. Loretta screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh my God, Elliot." Her hand shook as she tried to lift his head, her eyes wide with panic. But Jamal's face was unreadable now, his breathing loud in the silence that had suddenly filled the room. His grip on the decanter tightened again. "Move," he said flatly. No, Jamal, the second swing was harder. The crystal caught her across the temple, the impact echoing through the room. Her body slumped sideways beside Elliot's, her hair spilling across his shoulder. The decanter slipped from Jamal's fingers, landing on the carpet with a soft, wet thud streaked with dark red. For a moment, all he could hear was the blood pounding in his ears. The house was still, save for the faint jazz still playing somewhere in the background. Jamal stood there, chest heaving, staring down at the two bodies, one his lifelong friend, the other the woman who had raised him. His mind was a whirl of disbelief and fury, the enormity of what he'd done not fully sinking in. The scent of roasted chicken and spilled wine hung in the air, mixing with something metallic. Jamal stepped back, almost tripping over the fallen chair, then turned and walked toward the kitchen counter. His eyes landed on Elliot's car keys lying beside his phone. He grabbed them without thinking, his movements jerky, his hands trembling. The front door stood wide open as he stepped into the night, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. He didn't look back at the house, the lights still glowing warmly through the windows as though nothing inside had changed. The engine of Elliot's car roared to life, and within seconds, he was gone, leaving behind a scene that would soon draw flashing lights and questions with answers no one wanted to believe. The next morning, the quiet of Willow Heights was broken by the sound of sirens. A neighbor had noticed Loretta's front door standing wide open and went to check. What they found inside made them stagger backward into the yard, screaming for someone to call 911. Within minutes, the street was alive with flashing lights and uniformed officers moving in and out of the house. Detective Carla Vance arrived soon after, her expression set and serious as she stepped over the threshold. The sight in the dining room was grim. Two bodies side by side on the floor, the table still set for dinner, wine soaked into the tablecloth, and a broken crystal decanter lying nearby. It didn't take long for her team to piece together the basics. The positions of the bodies, the signs of a struggle, and the missing car all pointed to someone close. Witnesses quickly mentioned Jamal Rivers, who had been seen acting strangely in recent weeks. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting the previous night, though no one had called it in. The search for him began immediately. By mid-afternoon, a patrol unit spotted Elliot's car parked outside a run-down roadside motel 30 miles away. Officers moved in quietly, surrounding the building before knocking on the door of a room registered under a fake name. Jamal answered, looking hollow-eyed and worn, as if the weight of what he'd done had drained him completely. He didn't resist when they cuffed him, only muttering under his breath as they led him away. At the station, Detective Vance sat across from him in the interrogation room. The initial silence was long, heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Tell me what happened." Jamal stared at the table for a long moment before lifting his gaze. The words came slowly at first, then faster, fueled by resentment, heartbreak, and rage. He talked about betrayal, about humiliation, about watching his best friend and his grandmother share something that should never have happened. By the time he finished, his voice had gone quiet again, the fight in him replaced by something like exhaustion. Later, as the coroner's van pulled away from Loretta's house, the neighborhood was left in stunned silence. People who had known the Rivers family for years stood on their porches, shaking their heads, unable to reconcile the smiling young man they remembered with the one now sitting in a jail cell. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond Willow Heights. It became the kind of headline people read twice, unable to believe the words. Friends of Elliot mourned a life cut short. Neighbors grieved for Loretta, whose warmth and generosity had once been the heart of the street. And everyone who had known Jamal was left to wonder how jealousy and pride could twist into something so deadly. If you've been watching this far, we want to hear your thoughts. What do you think drove Jamal over the edge? Could this tragedy have been prevented, or was it inevitable once the secret began? Drop your opinions in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories.